Thank you. Okay. I'm Emma Kerr, I work for Transparency International, and I've actually had the pleasure of being taught by both Leandra and Naila. I can see a few SOA students dotted around as well. One of the things that Transparency International is doing is pushing for a sustainable development goal on governance. And given that the panel has shown some scepticism about the MDGs and the upcoming SDGs, I wonder what they think about that and whether they think it will make a difference and what would need to be done in terms of implementation in order to ensure that it addressed inequality.
Great, thanks, Emma. Let's take another couple of questions from over there.
Hi, Neva Freshville from CAFOD, where I work on post-2015. I think I've been really encouraged by the panel today in the talk around a kind of bottom-up, participatory, inclusive approach as being effective in developing and delivering the post-2015 agenda. Having said that, there is a kind of call for a revolution taking place within the UN process at the moment, and that's in the data revolution. And I've spent the weekend, as I'm sure some other people in this room have, commenting on the first draft of the Data Revolution report. And one thing that I've been incredibly disappointed about by that is the technocratic top-down approach that they're taking to that data revolution, and they're not looking at it from a participatory, inclusive, bottom-up approach where people have a role to play in deciding what data is gathered, how it's collected, how it's disseminated, how it's analysed, and I think that's a real missing piece of the puzzle, and I'm disappointed to see that that revolution, I mean, no revolution has ever been successful without people at the heart of it, kind of moving forwards without people in place. I'd be interested to hear any thoughts on that.
We take one more question from over there, please. Yep.
Great, thank you. I'm Pfizer Shaheen from Save the Children. This is working. Just a comment, I guess, to build on the discussions on inclusive economic policy, so what the economic agenda is doing. And I call, I guess, to think about kind of beyond cash transfers, beyond redistribution. So this conversation now about pre-distribution, what are we thinking, what's happened in countries to address things like wages and jobs that will result in long-term sustainable ways to address inequality. And I think there's a real lesson to be learned from places like the UK, where there were kind of these cash transfer programs, but there wasn't much done on the issue of jobs and wages and making sure that equality is built into the economic system. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. Let's just take one last question from this side.
Okay, thank you. When me and my cousin Bubba, who's a taxi driver, get together to set the world to rights. Oh, sorry, I'm Carl Miller. I'm just interested in the topic. I usually start off by saying the rich and the wealthy and the elites, they've not kept up with their part of the social contract. And that's one of the big problems in society. He, on the other hand, says, no, it's because the rich and the elites despise the poor and they treat them worse than dogs. Now, I've been recently reading an article on the definitions of poverty. And it seems to me one of the big problems we have in developmental issues is the attitudes of not only the elites, but also the civil servants towards the disadvantaged and the poor. And I think any program for the post-2015 need to find a way of changing the attitude of the elites and the civil servants.
And very succinctly expressed as well, which is also brilliant. The question about the goal on governance and inequality, Gerard, do you want to, or the link between the governance goal and inequality, would you like to offer some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it relates back to our earlier conversation in terms of the shift we're seeing in SDGs from consequences to causes. Right, and you'll know that high-level panel had offered, I think, a more ambitious set of thinking around governance than is currently in the Open Working Group definition, which lumps together governance, peaceful societies, and security. I think it's absolutely right. We should and will continue to be within DFID elsewhere ambitious about that governance agenda and really looking at what that means in terms of what the report's saying about qualities of governance, inclusive government that has voice and accountability at its core. So that feels very, very real to us at the moment. This is all, the great tactical game that is under play now over the next 12 months. But I think, based on not just on this report, but all of the thinking we've done before, it does need a greater push.
Any of the other panelists want to offer thoughts on the governance link? No.
I do.
Yeah.
I think the governance issue, I'm not sure how a governance goal would be articulated, but I think it's definitely just as an issue, something that's of fundamental importance, because I think that we've seen over the past few years, like I think the world has sort of a crisis, a governance crisis, you know, and there's sort of a really strong, people have lost faith in representativeness, like they don't feel represented in a lot of different countries, and we've seen that through some of the mass protests. And I think that even countries that are considered middle income countries that have, you know, let's say in the MDG time, they've progressed and they're considered success stories. There are also the places where we saw massive protests, like Tunisia, like Egypt, revolutions per se, even though, well, they weren't necessarily very successful, but anyway, that's another story. But I think that, you know, questioning a little bit about what kind of governance that do we want or do we need, I think that that's really important, but it's also a little bit of contentious when you put it into an international framework, because, you know, there's a lot of biases towards what kind of governance is the right governance when it comes to inserting that into an aid framework. Then, you know, there's also like donor countries will want to put these kinds of conditions about how they see governance, and there's probably going to be a backlash from countries in the South. But I do think that keeping the issue of governance and maybe fleshing it out more at the national level, I do think that that's something fundamental.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just very quickly. I mean, I think part of the challenge with the governance indicator is that no country will ever say, well, I mean, I'm for bad governance. So in a way, I mean, it's in that sense, it's kind of like redundant in a way. But I mean, it's not that governance is not important, but governance needs to be discussed again at different levels and be part of national conversations and things like that. I mean, one of the things that struck me as a big paradox relates to what Laila was saying is over the past 40, 50 years, we've seen a massive increase in countries that have some sort of democracy. But more people are disenchanted with the democratic process. And then by some measures, governance, if you measure governance by democratic process, is improving, but then by other measures, it's really not. And I think we haven't really paid much attention to that kind of like dynamic that's happening at the national level in terms of like, well, yeah, we see more kind of like electoral democracy, but we see a lack of representation through that electoral democracy. So I just want to say that.
Ricardo, can I also ask you to take on, give some thoughts on the data revolution area as well, in relation to this agenda? Yeah, so
I face a trade-off on the weekend. I either read the report or I read the data revolution report. So I chose to read this report. But I've been in a couple of meetings on the data revolution, and I think the key, I mean, one of the key questions is what do we mean by data and what do we mean by revolution? And then you put it together, what do we mean by data revolution? I mean, some people, I mean, at some point we were saying, well, we don't need a data revolution. We just need to start collecting censuses and household surveys again. Yeah. Because I mean, we don't need to do new things. We just need to start doing the things that we were doing 15 years ago or 20 years ago. When you look at the number of household surveys available to measure poverty in Africa, it's been reducing over the past 15 years. And then how can we count the most marginalized groups if we don't have those resources? I read the first 5 pages of the Data Revolution report, and I was happy to see that they had a strong equity element in there. I didn't read the rest, but I mean, I think the key is that whatever we understand as data revolution is not something that increases the information gap between what we know and the most marginalized groups. Because, say, people are talking about big data, but big data is basically driven by technology. And even though it's really exciting, if you are a data geek, as I am, it can increase the gap between what we know of like certain groups of the population and the most marginalized, because the most marginalized don't have cell phones, they don't access the internet, they don't use Twitter, and things like that. So I think it's really important that we keep on pushing that whatever that means on whatever the data revolution means, it closes that gap of information across sectors of society.
Great, thanks very much. Any other thoughts on that area from others? No. Leandro, I'm sure you were nodding pretty hard at the points from Pfizer about inclusive economic development and the sort of significance of fundamental changes. Do you want to add anything in response to that?
Yes, in response to the question on wages and work, that has been, I think, what is missing. No government has been putting forward reforms of labor codes, for example. We haven't decided to sort of reform the neoliberal reforms that most countries carried out in their labor sectors. But what can be seen from the two cases that I looked at, Ecuador and Brazil, is that the state has been playing a stronger role in the domestic economy. And it has been, in the case of Brazil, it's been formalizing jobs. So, and it has been doing important progress in that sense. So people that used to work in the in the informal sector has been made formal. They have access to pension, they have access to rights, which is an improvement. In Ecuador, again, it's much earlier, but the state is also trying to play a role within the economy that will have an impact on jobs and wages. But I think that's one of the most important goals that we should have, to provide conditions for people to have decent job and formal jobs, right? And the current economic model that we have has not been producing formal job. It has actually increased dramatically the informal sector. So that's why I said earlier that the elephant in the room is the neoliberal model, because most of the causes of inequality, I think, are linked to that. But the cases that we looked at show that there is room of maneuver for certain states. And again, it depends on certain conditions, one of which is a civil society, an organization and social movement that are active, that have certain links with political parties, that have the ability to negotiate with political party and not be like simply clients of political parties, which very often leads actually to conflict between leaders and social movements. So the improvement going ahead is going to come out, I think, of conflict and the ability of contestation from civil society. And that's why, related to the other question, I think we need to move away from this model, the provider model, this idea that we can solve poverty by throwing money at it, right? We need to think differently about poverty and about the relationship between state official and, quote unquote, the poor. And that's why I talk about empowerment. And I think the term empowerment has also sort of been played around with, but I think it at least indicates that marginalized people and poor people need to be able to push for their own agenda, and there needs to be some kind of recognition of that institutionally in one way or another.
Thanks, Leandro. Yeah.
Could I come in on that? Because I think it's absolutely right that we need to move away from a model that is not only failed to generate decent jobs, but has contributed to this completely unacceptable levels of inequality. But it also brings me to the other question that you raised about, and the story that Lila told us about her. And that is, I was very struck recently by, even in the UK now, we are governed by people who have less and less in common with ordinary people. And that is true in countries which have far longer historically established inequalities, which have now grown. So the elites, I think, now live in a kind of stratosphere where they have no idea what ordinary people have to struggle for when you cut the public swimming pools and so on. But I think there's another I've lost my thought, actually. I'm sorry. Stop.
Well, I mean, that relates, I think, to Carl's question
Yes.
about behaviours and attitudes
It's
of
exactly,
bureaucrats.
I was exactly trying to pick up on that question. And, oh yes, I know what the other point is. You know, when we see the kinds of money and remuneration and salaries that people are being paid, I cannot understand why there is not more questioning about how anyone could possibly be worth that much money. You know, we are in a speculative form of capitalism where it's gambling, you know, that people are gambling and making huge amounts of money and yet claiming the rights of citizens and you know, claiming to be productive people. So I think this business about, you know, the contempt of the elite for ordinary people, I think it should be reversed. And we should have show a bit more contempt for people who from very little effort seem to make staggering amounts of money.
Ricardo.
Yeah, no, I obviously see a big problem of an economic system that creates these massive income disparities and things like that. And I think when I was reading the report, and I was reading about the contestation of the elites and all the argument about political participation and things like that, then it came to my mind that this concentration of income makes the problem worse, because then there are two elements. One is it's harder because the rich have more influence in the political process and get to decide what the rules of the game are and things like that. But another problem that's often overlooked is that the opportunity cost for change is much higher for them. So they're like, if there's contestation to the system, they're going to try to avoid that change because the opportunity cost is much higher, because they got a lot more to lose. And I think we're seeing that in many cases, you know, and I think that's something that I mean relates to Naila's point.
Great, thanks very much. I'd like to take another round of questions, but Rob, Will, I've lost the screen on the iPad, so I'm not seeing anything coming in, just in case there are questions coming in. Can we go, let's take a block in the middle and then I'll go to the left in the next set.
My name is Bronwyn Manby. I'm a consultant and visiting fellow at the Centre for Human Rights at the London School of Economics. I've been doing a lot of work in the last few years on the right to a nationality, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And the first point of exclusion is to say that somebody doesn't belong. They don't even have the right to take part in the discussion. And it's a question, really, about the study and to what extent that point was considered. I'm thinking of Nepal, for example, which has a large population of stateless people. It's an issue in Ethiopia, especially in the context of ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, which creates something of the national problem. If you are an Oromo in Oromia, they're fine, but if you're an Afar in Oromia, you have no rights there because you're not an indigene, you're not a native of the state. So it's a question about to what extent the study dealt with that question. It won't be so much an issue in Latin America because the nationality rules are much more inclusive. And then a supplementary question really is in relation to the SDGs, and there is a push for a legal identity to be put in there, and just what comments the panels have about where that debate currently stands and what form it might take to be most useful to address the questions that we are discussing now.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Paul Dornan, University of Oxford and Young Lives cohort study. My question actually fits very neatly with the first part of your question, which is that we've been talking very much about accountability and the role of social movements within that, but not all civil society is the same, and there's no real reason to suppose that civil society wouldn't necessarily be as exclusionary in certain forms as other aspects of the way in which things happen. So in trying to bring forth that kind of social mobilisation, what do you do to try and reach the problem that we're addressing about having voices from the very poorest in society?
Great, thanks very much.
Hi, it's Nicola McIver from Oxfam. I work with Ricardo, but I work on aid and inequality. My question actually follows on a bit from yours, but more looks at the role of donors in this. If we Ricardo picked up on the closing space for civil society, and we obviously want nationally driven development and reduction of poverty and inequality, and therefore, supporting the space for civil society, but as you say, not all civil society groups will necessarily drive that change. So how, in the context of firstly, is there a role for donors to intervene in this, to support this, and then if so, how? In the context of value for money, because supporting space for civil society, you don't necessarily get tangible outcomes and it's difficult to measure. So any reflections on that?
Great.
Hi, my name is Emily Budell. I work for Business in the Community. And I would be curious to hear what the panel thinks the role for the private sector is in the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Let's kick off with the first question about the
Nationality.
About nationality, about the proto target on identity registration and documentation, but also the question about how is that how can that be framed in such a way that it doesn't have exclusionary elements? Nyla, do you want to, or if you don't,
let me think about it.
Yeah, I'll ask someone else. Gerard, any thoughts on that?
I was hoping to get a bit more time as well.
It wasn't the first question.
So we're all swerving it. No, absolutely.
No, you put two questions in together, you see, and then it became difficult.
Yeah. Sorry, just take that.
So, I mean, as I understand it, so the birth registration stuff is in SDGs currently, right? Mm-hmm. But that's only the very tip of the process, and actually, who counts and whose voice counts, and a lot of that is not in formal legal processes. It's deeply embedded structural inequalities that persist over time. I guess the other interesting thing for me around that is about migrants and how one deals with shifting workforces and migrancy. And again, I don't have clear answers for that, but you can see how that's going to play out too. Now, hopefully I've given Nyla enough time.
Well, I mean, interestingly, it's, obviously we all would like everyone have that right to some identity that allows them to participate in their society. And it is precisely migrants, I think, that I've been looking at recently. And really I've been looking at how women workers make claims. So I've looked at women workers in the global value chains, right, in the international, whatever. Women workers in the local informal economy, and there are clear pathways through which they make claims. It's migrant workers who fall between different jurisdictions, who in a sense fall into your category, that nobody wishes to uphold their rights. And what has been interesting there is that people have gone international. So rather, because the Migrant Workers Convention has not been signed by anybody, well, been signed by very few people, it's looking at the broader range of human rights. So until and unless people have these state identification forms, the only set of rights that they can appeal to are those of... I'm very struck also by what's been happening with the Rohingyas in Burma, who I think are another group who've lived forever in Burma but are now not being acknowledged either by the countries from which they originated in. So I don't know how much of this has actually come up in the report, because the report, I think, was very much influenced by the country case studies and what was important in those. But it's clearly a very important issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Matt Andrews, who first suggested the, at least to my knowledge, the notion of an identity element to the targets, actually saw it as a state capability issue rather than an empowerment issue. So there are obviously those elements. The other thing I think that's interesting about Latin America is that the right to identity movement, is quite mature there, which it maybe isn't in some other areas. The question, Ricardo, I think I have to give you the question about civil society and what happens if the social movements are in themselves exclusionary or don't include those who are most deprived of voice.
No, that's a good question, and obviously is not an easy one, because as Paul said, there are different movements and different types of civil society. So I'm Mexican. I'm from Mexico, and so the Mexican unions are famous for being terrible unions, and they give unions a bad name. You talk to most Mexicans, and Mexicans will say, I'll stay away from a union, which is really, really damaging, because then what you have is a country where there is no organized contestation at the local or national level, and then what you have is what's happening in Mexico, because then you have what remains as an organized force that can provide any contestation to the state is the organized crime. So which is a tragedy, a real tragedy. So how do we enforce, or not enforce, but how do we create the space for the growing of the good civil society? I mean, that's the $1 million question. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. I probably would be telling all of you right now what that is. I don't. But I think part of the solutions are in the report. How did that happen in Brazil? How did that happen in Ecuador? How did that happen? So what made Lula possible? Lula comes from a union. But he came from a different kind of union. So what made the rise of Lula possible in a context of a very unequal society? Was it the constant devaluation? Was it the constant financial crisis? Was it what was it? I don't know. My guess is that it's context specific, but I'm sure that answer would not be very helpful.
There is a classic analysis around the alliance with the middle class, isn't there? And transparency and building a case for certain kinds of governance improvements and so on. And indeed, also this sense, I think, with respect to the PT, that they may have in the last election lost traction a bit with that constituency that they used to have.
But what made that alliance with the middle class happen?
Yeah, exactly.
What I think is interesting about the Brazilian case is that Lula comes to power after 20-something years of trying to get to power. So the PT that comes to power is a very different PT than the PT of the 1980s, of the union strikes and the social movements. But it never really completely lost that identity. And a lot of the early leaders of the union, but also the social movement, made their way into the state or into NGOs, and to a certain degree, some of them maintain their links to social movements. So you have like what Fox talks in terms of thickening of civil society, that is like a 20-something year process, which later on, when Lula comes in, sort of feeds into the government in one way or another, simply sometimes because they know them. They know each other. They've been going through different processes for 20-something years. So it allows for that dynamism. But I wanted to sort of respond to the question by putting both the aid question and the social movement question together, because I think there was a role of actually the aid community in this building of social movements, because aid at the time was much more or less preoccupied with transparency, accountability, etc., etc. A lot of the money went to workshops, training, that things that are not necessarily tangible in terms of value for money, but that create social capital, creates leaders, create people that are able to engage with the state, are able to understand how the state works. So, and that's not only Ecuador and Brazil, that's throughout Latin America. And a lot of Catholics organization actually helped in the training of a generation of leaders that were later either involved in governments or created NGO and all that. So today, the aid community doesn't have that ability anymore of supporting events, gatherings. When you organize a gathering in Latin America, it's the place where people, marginalized people, are brought in. They spend 2 days in a workshop. They discuss the political conjuncture, and so they grow politically by being present in those places. But how do you report back to your funder and saying, well, that matters, right? So there's a problem. I understand that transparency, accountability are important, but then there's a problem if you can't fund and support civil society initiative that can have a long-term effect. And that's what more or less happened in a lot of countries in Latin America, including Mexico, actually. But in terms of the case that we looked at, in Brazil, these national conferences that I was talking about, because of their scope and their breadth, really bring in a large amount of people, and not only the dominant NGOs or the dominant social movement. You have people from a really, really broad range of origins that are able to participate in the municipal, then in the state, or in the national conference. And that also contributes to generate a civil society that is active. And that doesn't necessarily solve all the problem, because if you look at the protest that happened a year or 2 years ago in Brazil, no NGO activists could see that coming. They thought that they were representing their society sufficiently or appropriately, and there's also a problem there in terms of the NGOization of civil society in Brazil.
Sure. Leila.
Yeah, no, I just on that same point, I thought, what happened last year in Brazil with those mass demonstrations was amazing to see the reaction of organized civil society to those mass demonstrations. I mean, apart from it not having happened, I think since the military dictatorship, for so many people to come out on the streets, it was a total shock to all of, what is considered a very well organized and very active civil society. So it was a total surprise and a massive surprise. So I think that really showed like this kind of changing face of how civil society organizes, or how, I think there's some of the civil society that organizes and is based on analysis of what's right and what's wrong and why, and there's others which is a much more sort of visceral kind of explosion. It's like a combination of piled up inadequacies of a society, and it's what happened in Egypt. It's what happened in a lot of different countries in the Arab world as well. It wasn't one thing. So I think that's something that's really interesting, and it is true that a lot of the social mobilizations that happen, they happen on the margins of mechanisms that are set into the sort of governance mechanism of let's say a country like Brazil. So that's something that's really interesting, and that I think that a lot of the NGOs have actually lost touch with the bases. They don't necessarily represent people in rural areas, or they don't necessarily represent marginalized urban residents. So that's something that, I also wanted to link a little bit to this aid question that you were also mentioning, and even linking the aid question back to what we were speaking about a little bit before, about this sort of norm setting and what kind of, because I think that ultimately we need to sort of, through this new framework and through action at the national level, we need to start to change what we consider progress and how we measure progress, not just in terms of metrics, but what it actually means to be a more advanced society. Like it's, many people have spoken about it. Obviously, shouldn't just be measured in economic terms, but we need to sort of look at how justice needs to be put at the core. So there's the social, the economic, and the environmental justice, and that's what would take us more towards what I think will actually take us to more durable form of sustainable development. But for that, to sort of break that all down, to some extent or not, that could justify some, aid money or some, programs and policies and stuff like that would be able to also then be channeled towards supporting people to be organized. If it's done with an appropriate analysis, we know that that's one of the key factors to actually shifting power imbalances and shifting the key thing, which is one of the key things that needs to be shifted. So therefore, aid money and national policies can be oriented that way as well.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen examples where that has been done as well. So that's great. Gerard, the question on the private sector, which is kind of a key thing.
I thought you were going to ask me about whether donors could do anything.
Well, let's ask you that as well.
Can I have that first?
Yeah, have that first.
Right. Sorry,
I'm not going to give up.
No, it's fine. I'm not going to go away. But I thought Paul and Nicola's questions were really good, and I think it's a really interesting point. And I have to say I totally agree with you on that, Leila. So the first mistake we would make is if we believe that the SDGs are about how we deliver aid, right? That's a fundamental mistake right there. And so we need to move away from that in the first instance. I think the point about, and taking from this report actually, really interesting about the contribution of, if you like, the formal NGO sector to social movements, at best tentative. But how you promote that sort of change struggle is really interesting, right? And I, in my job at the moment, I am talking to the sector about, well, what are the challenges you face, actually? How are you planning for your own redundancy? How is the world changing around you? And are you ready for that change? Because, that's a fundamental question. And I have to say, both within the formal donor sector and, apologies, with our key sort of NGO stakeholders, that we don't really have an answer to that yet. People know there's change coming, and and the power of social movements create change that aren't organised, don't have bank accounts, don't have memorandum of understanding, but do create change is a real issue for us. And so we do need to think that through. I don't apologise at all, and never will, for transparency and accountability. Right? I mean, we've just been saying SDGs should be absolutely focused on transparency and accountability. I do think there's something about value for money and how we measure value for money, and I think in a way that goes back to how we think about governance and theories of change around governance. Value for money is about doing the right things at the right time to get to the right outcome. It doesn't mean that you automatically descend into price per net, etc. So I think there is an academic challenge for us to think about how we spell out that theory of change and show that we're doing the right things at the right time. And I think that point about creating flexible spaces, your gatherings point, right, is a really, really good point. There's a theory of change that shows that to be true. What we need to do is find a way to manage and capture that theory of change and be able to express it quite strongly, because I think anything that promotes rigidity in organisational forms is going to fail in this new world that we face going forward. And I do think there is a space. If the SDGs are about national change as well as international change, there is a space, I think, for external donors. I think the private sector is a really interesting question, right? And you'll see, the goal on decent work has 12 different indicators. I think that's a really interesting question. If you met all those indicators, would that fundamentally challenge the neoliberal model or not? And what's the tensions in there? Again, one of the challenges we're putting out to our NGO partners is, well, how are you working alongside the private sector? And that isn't just the large multinationals. That's that whole range of way in which people create and find jobs for themselves. And again, I think if we're about, the SDGs is not just static governments and static aid donors deploying that aid, it's about how you draw in a whole group of people and think about positive social change and inequality.
Yeah, I must admit the accountability issue is not clear at all to me.
I think that's a fair challenge.
Any other thoughts on the private sector area? Or no? Okay, well let's move along then, because you've been very patient over here, so I want to make sure we get some questions in from this side as well. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Silvia Stefanoni from HelpAge International, and I was very interested in the report saying that the importance of social movements and political movements as key to transformation, but also social protection still be an important element that in the study came out as at least a roadmap, perhaps, on the way to changes in terms of addressing inequalities. And what my question is about how do we ensure that the social protection, if it is a tool, is really understood as a fundamental systemic change, as a redistributive rather than a welfare element, that it's linked to, it's not about compensation, but it's about equity. It's not about inclusion, but it's about equity. So I would be very interested to understand what recommendation would you have then to how do we have that clearly in the SDG as a systemic change?
Thanks very much, Sylvia.
Yeah, my name is Mats Horsmar from the Swedish Expert Group for Aid Studies, which is a new setup. Thanks for a fascinating discussion and a very good report, I must say, without having read it. But I'd like to pose one of these impossible what-if questions. This report was based on the continued discussion based on case studies from Latin America and Asia and one African country, if I understand correctly. And medium countries, various economic models. So it's a good choice of countries. But what if you have had studied 7 poor African countries? Would there be any different analysis coming out, do you think?
Yeah, my name is Jutta Barth from the German Technical Corporation. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. And my question would be, when I hear this and the changes which have been occurred in the different countries, sometimes we say it's more about their own political economy, a national political economy, than because there have been an MDG scheme at the international level. Perhaps the SDGs can be a little bit more powerful. What I would like to hear from you, do you see that for different actors involved as donors, working with national governments, cooperating with international civil society as well as national ones, do you find out that we need another procedure, that we need another way to do things as we are here, in a way of different kind of partnerships, or just go ahead like we have done, and sometimes with success?
Great, thanks very much. Yeah. Okay, good. Andrew, would you like to have a crack at the question about how would it have looked if we'd taken 7 poorer African countries? Or maybe not. That's a tough one.
I think what the study, thank you, what the study has very consciously done is look for countries, as Amanda was saying earlier on, where there was clear quantitative evidence that there had been some progress, or where, from all the evidence that we had, as in the case of Brazil, that we could surmise, we could guess that there would have been or should have been progress, and we wanted to look at the processes. And I think this question that Mats has posed now is a very good one, because these aren't, of course, no country is typical, but these are certainly not typical countries. The lessons from these countries, and I think this is a problem for how we translate into an SDG type discussion based on this study. The lessons from these countries are probably less transferable than had we chosen to study the 7 African countries that you were talking about. Maybe that's not so much true in Latin America. Maybe there's plenty of learning across Latin America that could happen on the basis of the Ecuador and Brazil cases. But clearly Africa's a gap here. We've taken Ethiopia. We tried to include Benin, but actually the people that we had a dialogue with in Benin were purely, they couldn't accept that there had been progress, the progress that the quantitative work seemed to reveal. We had a similar discussion in Malawi. So we did have some evidence that there had been some other countries in sub-Saharan Africa where there had been progress, or at least a lack of things getting worse for these very marginalized groups. But we couldn't then pursue that, at least in the context of the time frame that we had. So I think this poses us with quite a challenge for the future, because, and this is a challenge that actually a smaller group of us are going to talk about this afternoon in a round table. If you take a more typical group, this word typical, can somebody find a different word, but a less exceptional group of countries. Many of them have signed up to some of the international conventions. Some of them have put these international conventions into laws. Some of them have some, seemingly radical legislation which has been passed at one point or another. And I think we need to try to understand. I think somebody put it earlier. What are the moments? What constellation of forces come together to enable that progressive legislation to be passed, to enable the international convention to be put into national law? there are some energies there, and we need to try and really understand what goes behind them. But the evidence for this is really scarce. There's really very little evidence on these sorts of questions. I mean, there was even little evidence in these stellar countries that we have tried to investigate. So I think the evidence on, for example, what measures against discrimination work where and why is really very scarce. So I think this is work which needs to be done. If the world is really serious about poverty eradication, getting to zero, this is absolutely essential.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm going to pass to Gerard now because I know he has to leave in about 5 minutes. So, anything you want to pick up there, Gerard, either on that question or on the understanding of social protection as a redistributive kind of social justice instrument, or the question from Chantal about different ways of doing business for donors, what this means?
So if you're going to be serious about inequality, it has to be both political and disruptive. You know, those two features need to be within it. So the interesting thing about social protection, and Nyla's comments around India and elsewhere, is where it's allied in terms of rights and activism as well, and that is absolutely where you'd see that going forward. I think just quickly that another way of doing things is in exactly the same point, right? Have we got the sort of current global governance framework in terms of what would be right for the SDGs going forward? No, we don't yet. I think that's fair to say, and I think what we're trying to do at the moment is craft one. I guess a note of realism as well. I mean, we're still in the MDG period, right? All the stuff that's happening at the moment is around the MDGs. That stuff is going to go on. The world is not going to be different from September the 31st, 2015. So we're in that sort of transition rather than being a cut-off point. These ideas are now coming forward in terms of the SDGs. We can be applying them now, some of them. We don't need to be waiting necessarily until that moment, but obviously that gives it greater heft. Can I just say a couple of other things just in terms of the report? And so the report's recommendation about universal and active targeting, I think, is absolutely right. I think you do need that combination, and that's something that we're really keen to pursue and to work through. Because, again, it feeds to both looking specifically at group-based inequality and identity and how that plays out, but also setting norms around universality. So I think that's absolutely right. Should there be a particular focus on inequality around the governance of the SDGs, some sort of moment again when we're looking at that and looking at progress? Absolutely. Should we be going below the 40%? Yes, we should, and we should be looking at that. I think the interesting question is, where are our tools and data at the moment to look at that 10 to 15 to 20%? What do we think is going to be the most meaningful? Because we could promise the world and then deliver very little. I'd much rather we delivered something that's really meaningful in that space and think that through. And I guess two final things. I mean, aggressive optimism is the phrase that's used in the report, right? Which is great. And I think we should be aggressively optimistic, right? I mean, I think that's the political moment to say, look, these things are possible. They're hard, and they're hard for the following reasons, but they are possible. But the report very, very clearly says they're difficult and they take time. It's decades upon work. Changing those structural inequalities, getting a middle class to engage politically and start to recognise a vision which is about including people who are below them in a pyramid is really hard. And so finding that balance between optimism and pragmatism is, I think, the key part of what we're trying to achieve in the run-up to September, and to make that focused.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Gerard. I know you have to leave at this point, but it's been great to have you here. So
thank you.
Many thanks. Andrew.
I want to answer the question on social protection seeing as an instrument of redistributive instrument. What was interesting about the cases that we looked at is that social protection, even though it existed in terms of a policy before these governments came into power, in both of these cases, social protection was linked to a constitutional obligation of the state. In the case of Brazil, I think it's Article 31 of the Constitution of 1988 that had a figure called, or a principle called social security, asegurança social, something like that, and which bestowed on the state the responsibility to implement policies that would tackle the issue of inequality or injustice. So it was the mobilization, the enshrining that principle into the highest law of the state that created this possibility, because it was there from in 1988, but it hadn't been mobilized until the Lula used it. But it had been placed there, and that comes back to the issue of the moment. It had been placed there by a broad discussion within Brazilian society that came out of the transition to democracy, in which several actors were able to put certain clauses within the constitution that were able to be mobilized afterwards. So I think the legal framework is really important, but it's not sufficient. It's not a sufficient condition. It needs political forces to make it a reality afterwards.
Thanks.
Can I do
Yeah,
that?
please
Yep.
do.
I'd like to address the social protection question as well. And I think what has happened with social protection is that it has evolved considerably from when it first arrived on the development agenda in the aftermath of the East Asian crisis in the late 1990s. And while it was initially a crisis response, it seems to me it has deepened and broadened and come to mean many different things. So I think it continues to be used in a very welfarist way in a number of countries. But I think other countries have recognized, on the one hand, social protection as a part of the social contract between the state and some of its most marginalized citizens. Because one of the things that social protection has been able to achieve is precisely to compensate for the deficiencies of systems of provision and so on that have never reached out to very poor people. So I think from that point of view, it has been redistributive. I think the discussion about universal versus residual, which continues, and I think we've come to a reasonable compromise about where you do need universal social protection, where you don't. The reaction to the last financial crisis, I think, is very interesting, that in places in East Asia and China, the response was to put in place forms of social protection that would restart the economy, whereas in other parts of the world, including the United Kingdom, we've gone in for austerity measures, which have not, served to kickstart the economy. So social protection, I think, lends itself to many, many different functions. But I think above all, what has been very fascinating is because it's reached out to so many marginalized groups, it has often been the first steps towards citizenship. It's often been the first time they have received an identity card, the first time that they have had any encounter with the state. So from that point of view as well, I think. So I don't see it as one animal, I see it as something that is interpreted very differently in different political contexts.
Right, thanks, Naila.
I just wanted to add a point building on what Naila was saying, because Brazil is at an interesting point right now with their social protection program and policy, that I think, just on the point that Naila is making on citizenship, I think that in part the mass protests that we had last year, and if you combine that with this, what they're calling this kind of new middle class, partially created through the social protection scheme, along with others like increase of minimum wage, blah, 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 other factors. But I think that what's interesting and what often is not necessarily spoken about is the fact that people have this sort of citizenship, and they have a stronger sense of entitlement and a stronger sense of pride, and they're actually willing to go out in the street and claim for rights. I don't think that that was really the case so much before, and I think that that's part of this kind of social transformation that's happened in at least Brazil, and I'm sure it's happened in some other places as well. But that kind of idea of like, I'm a citizen, I have rights, I'm not getting the rights that I deserve, that's something that's come about with some of these kinds of measures. I think there's a challenge, and it's something that the government now, and now for sure because Dilma won, but there's a lot of discussion about how the social protection scheme of Brazil can actually come into a new phase, like sort of expand itself, not just in terms of coverage, but also in terms of creating greater opportunities for the people who are receiving the Bolsa Familia. Because one thing that it definitely did do, apart from a redistributive scheme, it also created a huge number of new consumers for, you know, electrodomestics, for example, or, you know, which in a sense, fine. Like, I mean, people wanted washing machines too in their house or whatever. But I think that, you know, the whole discussion about how that scheme then sort of jumps to another level, I think is a big challenge of this type of a government who's already done that, but is still questioning about how to sort of bring it to another level.
Thanks. We've got two great questions in online, which are really good, if you like, final questions for the panel, as it happens. So it's fortunate that I only just managed, with William's help, to get the iPad working. It's good timing. The first question is from Stedman Noble at Plan, and he's highlighting this tension between a sort of technocratic, measurable targets kind of framework and what we're talking about, which is political and institutional change as being the key element for making progress on deep inequalities. So his question is, how can incentives for transformation be built into the way the SDGs are framed and the way they work? And the second question is from Paul at Lancaster University, and it's similar. It's, what are the specific, can you offer specific ideas, I guess, beyond what was presented by Chiara from the briefing paper? If we want the SDG project to reach people who suffer from multiple deprivations from intersecting inequalities, what would be the important things to see in the SDGs and to see in the framework? So they're, if you like, questions that both go to the heart of what we're talking about, and a good way of sweeping up the discussion to a degree. Who wants to have the first go at that? Leandro is looking sceptical, so I suspect he's just thinking transformation isn't going to happen in this kind of way. But do you want to start? Not particularly.
Yeah, I'd rather have someone, maybe someone else.
I think we touched upon some of these issues, but it's a good opportunity to summarize.
Yeah.
I think the norm setting element is very, very important, and I think ideas do matter, and these kind of like global arrangements that lead conversations are important. Human rights is a key example, and I think we shouldn't underemphasize the importance of these norms. And I think if the SDGs are going to have any effect, they have to. I mean, they have to be this big idea that of a society that we want to achieve, where no one's left behind, as the title says. But it has to contest that idea that average progress is okay. It needs to make it very clear that I mean, unless we bring everyone up, it won't be successful. And I don't think we have to just completely forget about the technocratic elements. I think the technocratic elements are important. You know, we know that nutrition in early stages of childhood is very important. We shouldn't just forget about that because we haven't talked about politics. We have to talk about that and politics. So we just have to instead of creating a false tension, create a positive dynamic between the technocratic element and the political element. So that's easier said than done, and we still haven't figured out how to create the space and the momentum so that political change happens at the national level. But my personal view is that the norms and the ideas are really, really important. And I mean, for me, the most important thing about the SDGs is that we'll have them for at least 15 years. You know what I mean? So it's not a declaration that we'll make today and then it's going to leave. We'll have that as part of our conversation in the next 15 years, and that's really important, that we can continue talking about this for the next 15 years. And that we have a document that says, well, I mean, this is something that was part of that historical moment in 2014.
That's good. So it's up to us to a degree. Nyla.
Rolling the two questions together in a way, I think the idea of a human rights framework within the system, but actually unpacking that framework, because there are certain key elements in it that lend itself to, because we're very aware that we're talking about the UN, as you said, and governments, not always the most representative and democratic, and we're trying to persuade them to take actions that will go against the grain of many of their own interests. So we have to find a language and a set of principles that cannot be kind of rejected, and so that's why the human rights framework and principles of non-discrimination, accountability, I don't remember all the other bits of it, these are very operational principles, and they ought to inform the way that we think. And the technocratic approach has to be built around that, in a way, how do we ensure measures that allow us to measure progress on that? And my second point, I think, is if there is another important lesson that comes out of this report, is the importance of consultations. And, going back to your idea about civil society, in a sense, we do not create civil society. It creates itself through all kinds of unanticipated ways. What we can do is crowd out, pathological forms of civil society. And that is through the kinds of consultations you only have around constitutions very often. But if one could have that conversation within countries and across countries in a way that brings everyone into that conversation so that they become a part, that they become aware of what these SDGs are about, and able to deliberate on them. And that whole thing, again, that Leandro said about flexible spaces, that whole importance of deliberative democracy and deliberative participation to be a part of that conversation, I think is very important. And these are, not, I can't see why people would want to reject them, but I'm sure they will.
Thanks very much, Leandro. No final words? Yeah, okay. Leila.
Yeah, I agree with what's already been said, and in a sense it summarizes, like Ricardo was saying, the main points that where we sort of started off our discussion about making sure that the targets and the indicators of this new framework are based on the human rights framework and agreements that countries have already made, and so make sure it doesn't just sit and pile dust like several others, but actually use it in a way that can hold the governments accountable. So the combination of, having that framework and the accountability and sort of unpacking it and making it more than just words, because we start to hear words so often that they kind of go by, like we hear it and they just go by, and we don't really think about how we're actually going to apply that. So I think that's a really important piece. But also just touching on this norm setting, I think like within the sustainable development, overall sustainable development discourse and the actual SDGs, I think that we need to also be careful about the narrative that comes out of there, because what we're seeing is that sustainable development actually means a very different thing to different people based on their sort of political agenda. And that's complicated, because we have big waves like green growth and green economy that sort of seem like they're addressing the sustainable development issues, but actually they're not. They're very technocratic. It's a very sort of technocratic agenda in a sense, and I think that being clear about what that narrative is and how that affects the norm setting, I think that that's really, really important. And for that kind of agenda to have enough traction and to gain enough traction in countries in the South, I think there also has to be some of these bigger questions need to come out, like we've seen through this Sustainable Development Goals discussions on common but differentiated responsibilities, and how that plays out not just internationally but nationally as well among elites. And so I think, if the sort of global South, as they say, doesn't see richer countries making concrete commitments in there about, either technology transfer or reducing emissions or increasing aid, and it seems like nobody wants to actually move on any of those things. So it touches a little bit on the question of, do we need new ways of doing things? So I think that those are some of the important points that still need to be addressed. I don't think, if we are going to be talking about sustainable development goals for the next 15 years, then we need to be a little bit clear about what is that narrative that because while we're talking about it, there's other ones that are sort of racing ahead. So, so yeah, I think that's important. And I think in terms of new ways of doing things, just at a very practical level, I think if we're talking about an agenda that tries to sort of reconcile the social, economic, and environmental dimensions, we actually don't have very many planning tools for creating like coherent policies that touch on those three dimensions. I don't think governments are even set up, like government policy making is not necessarily set up to actually contemplate like what are the trade-offs between these three dimensions and how are we going to use it as an assessment when we want to make policies and planning. So I think that's work needs to be done there as well.
Well, thanks very much to everyone. I'm not going to attempt summarising comments at this point. Obviously, it's a continuing conversation and a very sort of dynamic situation that we're going to be watching over the next year or through to September. I would like to conclude by thanking both the presenters from this morning, Chiara and Amanda, and doing such a great job of introducing it. And also the panel, of course, Ricardo, Leandro, Mola. And also all of you for the great questions. And we are providing lunch. I think it's through there, so you're all very welcome to stay and talk. Thanks.